When I first took the night security job at Mercy General Hospital, I thought it would be easy money. The hospital had shut down years ago, and the city was in the process of demolishing it to make way for a new mall. My job was simple: patrol the building and make sure no one got in. I wasn't worried about trespassers. It was too run down for anyone to bother. The first few nights were uneventful. The place was creepy, sure, with its peeling paint, broken windows, and abandoned equipment scattered around, but I'd seen enough horror movies to laugh it off. It was just an old building, nothing more. One Friday night, though, things changed. I arrived at my shift around 10 p.m. Frank, the guy I was relieving, seemed jittery. He handed me the keys and said, "Just keep an eye on the East Wing tonight." I heard noises there earlier. "Noises?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Probably rats," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Or the wind." I laughed and waved him off. "Get some sleep, Frank." The first few hours passed quietly. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, and listened to the sound of my boots echoing in the empty halls. Around midnight, I decided to check the East Wing. It was the oldest part of the hospital, mostly used for storage in its final years. The moment I stepped into the East Wing, the air felt different, heavier, colder. My flashlight flickered briefly, but I tapped it, and it steadied. The hallway was lined with old patient rooms, their doors hanging off their hinges. I peeked into each one, finding nothing but dust and broken furniture. As I turned a corner, I heard it, a faint sound like someone whispering. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't words, just soft, muffled whispers, like someone having a conversation I couldn't quite hear. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I took a deep breath and moved forward, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. In one of the rooms, I noticed something odd. A wheelchair, standing upright in the middle of the room, facing the corner. I could have sworn it hadn't been there during my last patrol. I walked over and examined it. Dust covered the seat and wheels, as though it hadn't moved in years. As I turned to leave, I heard the unmistakable sound of wheels creaking. I spun around, and the wheelchair was moving, slowly, but definitely moving, toward the door. My heart pounded as I backed out of the room, keeping my flashlight trained on it. I stumbled into the hallway, my pulse racing. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard another sound, a metallic clang, like something heavy falling. It came from the surgical suite down the hall. Against my better judgment, I headed toward the noise. The surgical suite was in shambles. Broken equipment lay scattered, and the overhead lights hung by their wires. In the center of the room, an old surgical table stood covered in dust. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my fingers trembling. That's when I saw it. On the far wall, someone, or something, had written a word in what looked like black grease. "Leave." I didn't need any more convincing. I turned to leave, but as I did, the door slammed shut. Panic surged through me as I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't human. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the room. I banged on the door, shouting for help. After what felt like an eternity, it swung open on its own. I bolted out of the room, sprinting down the hall without looking back. When I reached the security office, I grabbed my things and radioed Frank. "I'm done," I told him. "I'm not coming back." To my surprise, he didn't argue. "I get it," he said quietly. "I wouldn't either." I never went back to Mercy General. A week later, I heard the demolition crew refused to finish their work. One of them claimed to see something in the East Wing, something that shouldn't have been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never set foot in an old hospital again. It started as a simple gig, one of those odd jobs you take when you're trying to make ends meet. I had recently moved to a small town, and when I saw the ad asking for volunteers to assist with documenting items in St. Mary's Asylum, I thought, why not? It was an old psychiatric hospital set to be demolished in a few weeks, and a local historical society wanted to archive whatever they could. When I arrived, the building loomed against the overcast sky. Its cracked facade and boarded-up windows gave it a sinister air. The project lead, an older woman named Evelyn, handed me a flashlight and a clipboard. "The power's spotty," she said. "We'll work in pairs, but stick to the main areas. Don't wander off." I was paired with Mark, another volunteer about my age. He seemed friendly enough, though even he looked uneasy as we stepped into the asylum. The place reeked of mildew and decay, and the air was unnervingly cold. Our task was to inventory items in what used to be the children's ward. As we sifted through dusty toys, broken furniture, and old medical equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often I thought I heard faint noises, footsteps, maybe, or the distant sound of a door creaking. Mark laughed it off. "This place is old," he said. "It's probably just the wind." But the wind didn't explain what happened next. As we moved into a small side room, we found a set of cribs, each one tagged with a laminated card. The cards bore names and dates, presumably of the children who had once stayed there. One crib caught my eye, because its card had been crossed out in thick black marker. "That's odd," I said, pointing it out to Mark. He shrugged. "Probably just a mistake." I reached down to pick up a dusty stuffed bear from inside the crib. As I did, I felt a sharp, icy sensation run up my arm, almost like an electric shock. Startled, I dropped the bear and stepped back. "Did you see that?" I asked Mark. "See what?" "The crib. It moved." Mark frowned. "It's probably uneven floors. This place is falling apart." But I knew what I saw. The crib had shifted, just an inch, but it had moved. We decided to move on, but the uneasy feeling followed me. As we documented items in the next room, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. That's when we heard it. A faint humming, like someone was singing a lullaby. Mark froze. "You hear that?" I nodded, my throat dry. The sound was coming from the hallway we had just left. We shone our flashlights down the corridor, but it was empty. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice shaking slightly. The humming stopped. I suggested we head back to the main area, but Mark insisted we finish our section. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we moved deeper into the ward, the noises grew worse. Doors creaked, metal clanged in the distance, and once, we both heard what sounded like a child giggling. "I'm done," I finally said. "Let's go." Mark hesitated, but nodded. We started retracing our steps, only to find that the corridor had somehow changed. The door we had come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall. "This isn't right," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. We doubled back, trying different paths, but every hallway seemed to lead us in circles. The air grew colder, and I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. Then we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. We turned off our flashlights, pressing ourselves against the wall. The footsteps stopped just ahead of us. In the dim light filtering through a cracked window, I saw a figure, tall, thin, and wearing what looked like an old nurse's uniform. She, or it, stood there for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked away. "That's it," I said, grabbing Mark's arm. "We're leaving, now." We ran blindly, turning corners and climbing stairs until we finally found a door that opened to the outside. We stumbled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Evelyn was waiting by her car, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked. We didn't answer. We just got in our cars and left. I never went back, and a week later I heard that St. Mary's had been demolished. Sometimes, though, I think about the nurse. I wonder if she was real, or if something about that place had trapped us in its lingering history. Either way, I've stayed far away from abandoned hospitals ever since. There's something about old hospitals that always gave me the chills, but I never thought I'd find myself trapped in one, alone. I work as a maintenance technician, often called in for emergency repairs in odd locations. That night I was called to St. Albans Hospital, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was once a thriving facility, but years of neglect had turned it into a decaying relic. The local council wanted to repurpose the building, and my job was to inspect the electrical wiring. When I arrived, the air was thick with a musty, damp smell. The security guard, an old man named Frank, handed me a flashlight and a key. "Be careful in there," he muttered. "Strange things happen at night." I brushed off his warning with a nervous laugh. Ghost stories were common about places like this, but I didn't believe in them. The building was massive, its empty halls stretching into darkness. The walls were stained and old medical equipment was scattered around, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As I walked through the corridors, the silence was oppressive. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, making me feel like I wasn't alone. I started with the basement, where most of the electrical panels were located. The flashlight's beam flickered as I descended the creaking stairs, and my heart thudded against my ribs. The basement was worse than I imagined. Cold, damp, and filled with a strange smell like rotting metal. As I worked on the first panel, I thought I heard something faint. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. I froze, holding my breath. "Hello?" I called out. My voice bounced off the walls, but no one responded. Shrugging it off, I focused on my task. Just as I tightened the last screw, I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct dragging sound. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. I tried to stay calm, reasoning that it could be a rat or some other animal. Moving to the next panel, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash behind me. Whipping around, I saw an old metal gurney had toppled over. It had been standing upright just moments before. My nerves were frayed, but I convinced myself it was just an accident. However, when I turned back to my work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Small, wet footprints leading away from the gurney. They were unmistakably human. I followed the footprints, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. They led to an old surgery room. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an operating table in the center. Rusty tools were scattered around, and the walls were lined with cracked tiles. As I scanned the room, the light flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a man in a hospital gown, his face obscured by shadow. I blinked, and he was gone. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. That's when the sound started. A low, guttural moan that seemed to come in from everywhere and nowhere. It grew louder, filling the room until I could feel it vibrating in my chest. I bolted, abandoning my tools and sprinting up the stairs. But the nightmare wasn't over. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways they hadn't before. I could hear whispers now, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably real. Finally, I saw the exit sign ahead. Relief washed over me as I reached the door and pushed it open, only to find myself back in the basement. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in some kind of loop. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air as Frank shook me awake. "You're lucky," he said, his face pale. "Not everyone makes it out of there." I quit that job the next day. Whatever I experienced in St. Albans Hospital, I don't ever want to face it again. Even now, the memories haunt me, and I can't shake the feeling that a part of me never left that cursed place.